Trump just in the last 2 days sent a letter to Harvard that they would pursue them under a False Claims Act theory for submitting false claims and seek all the money that Harvard had received under those programs back.
How can they go backwards in time from monies that were given last year and the year before?
In Iraq, Halliburton was supposed to set up these filtering systems in the war zone. In some cases, the equipment didn't work, and yet they were billing 12 hours a day, every day, for doing this.
The law firm for the other side was saying that they were billing $3 million a month.
You exposed these troops to serious disease, all kinds of bacteria in the water that could have killed them, and you don't care. And the FDA doesn't want to look like we approved this drug and now it's out there killing people.
Hi, this is the American Whistleblower podcast, and today we have David Stone, who I've known for God knows how many years. Dave, do we know each other? 30?
Many.
Many.
Too many to remember. At least 25, I would say.
When I started, I had dark hair. When we started working together, I had dark hair. Dave is really a phenomenal lawyer, and I think the best in the business. A master. I always refer to Dave as a master chess player, and I don't mean the game. In litigations or even pre-litigation negotiations, things like that, whistleblowers wouldn't be able to exist if they weren't able to win in court or, navigate the halls of justice, Department of Justice, the IRS, all these agencies. And there are lawyers that know the law. There are lawyers that are good writers and write complaints. There are lawyers that do all of that, but also know that other thing. And that other thing is not what they teach in law school. Even though Dave went to Harvard Law School, and he'll teach you all about that, Dave is really a chess player. And that's how I always describe Dave to other people. If you want to move the ball down the field, or you want to move your pieces across the chessboard, Dave is smart like that. Dave is savvy and sharp. I would say sharp. And Dave, I'd just like to, why don't we start and just talk about where you grew up, where you went to school, how you came to be.
How I came to be, okay.
How you came to be.
My mother and my father, 9 months before. No, so I basically grew up in Cambridge. My father was a psychiatrist and ultimately started teaching at both the Harvard Medical School and later Harvard Law School. He taught Harvard law and medicine and contemporary social problems at Harvard Law School. So I lived in Cambridge. I grew up in Cambridge for the most part. Ultimately, sort of against my wishes, I wanted to go to Stanford film school and law school concurrently because I wanted to direct films. But I got waitlisted there. So what happened is I went to try to play professional soccer, and because I'd been waitlisted at Stanford for the film school, I got into the law school, but I couldn't get into the film school. They waitlisted me because they like to have examples of your film. They like people that have actually made commercially, which I had some involved, but not what they wanted. In any event, I went to try to play professional soccer because I was a soccer fanatic. I played at Harvard. I ended up at Harvard, and then ultimately my soccer career was very short because my own teammate in a scrimmage with me basically attacked me and kicked me in the leg and tore my quadriceps in 2 different places. And I said, maybe this is not when my own teammate is injuring me. I don't
now,
even.
That happened in college.
That happened in professional ranks. I went and I was playing for a reserve team of the Washington Diplomats, which was in the NASL. And so I was trying to make that team, and it was that summer we were scrimmaging the the first team, and there was a player on the first team that didn't like that I kind of dribbled around him in a scrimmage. And so the next time that the ball was chipped up to me, he just basically cut my legs out from under me. And that's what happened. So then I said, okay, I don't think professional soccer is where I want to be. So I went back and I pursued Harvard Law School. I got admitted at Harvard Law School. And like a year later, I went to Harvard Law School. So
Okay. Explains a lot about what happened in your later life when you tell a story about the film school
yeah,
and the soccer team, because I won't tell you, but I know what happened to you later in life. But it's interesting. As long as I've known you, I never knew that about you, and now it all fits. Now it all makes sense to me.
yeah.
So you go to Harvard Law School, and what happens next? How are things at Harvard?
Good. My only problem with Harvard Law School is that my father was a professor at Harvard Law School, and I knew all the professors. They used to come to my house, watch Boston Bruins hockey games and Boston Celtics games. And so they felt like they knew me. And so when they needed somebody to call on in a class and everybody was kind of not raising their hand, they would call on me because they figured, well, he knows me, so he's not going to be intimidated by me. So that was not fun for the first couple of months, but I actually really loved Harvard Law School. I actually think the teachers at Harvard Law School were better at teaching than the teachers at Harvard University. The teachers at Harvard University were all trying to do research and write books, and teaching was what they had to do in order to pursue those things, but they weren't like a lot of them weren't focused on being the best teachers they could be. I felt like the teachers at Harvard Law School really wanted to teach, and they were very good at it. So I'm one of the few people who actually enjoyed law school. I really liked it.
But did it make it harder on you in terms of getting grades? Because was there a higher expectation of you because of who your dad was?
Um, I mean, a little bit, I think. I think some of the professors there held me to a somewhat higher standard. Um, but, I mean, a lot of the grading was, blind grading and things like that. And a lot of the stuff was some of the stuff was multiple choice. So I don't think ultimately had that much impact. I will say that I think it may have affected some of my interactions with my classmates because they kind of felt like I was part of the faculty instead of part of the student body. But other than that, it was fine.
Do you think the fact that your dad that your dad was a psychiatrist, did that affect anything? I mean, was that harder? I just had a lot of friends in med school, and their fathers were psychiatrists, and it was harder on them. I mean that legitimately. It was just rougher. I don't know why, but it was
Yeah,
just
my
harder.
my father. It wasn't about being a psychiatrist. It was just about being a father who was very demanding uh, and very I'll tell you two quick stories about my father, which basically tells you everything you need to know about my father. So, my father, um, very erudite, very well read, very smart guy, um, in and knew like all fields. You know what I mean? It didn't matter what field you brought up. He'd read the book, he'd seen the painting, he whatever it was. So anyway, he had written. This was when he was young. He had written an article on Roe v. Wade, uh, and and it's terrible that I don't remember who the justice was who wrote that. I think it was Brennan, but whoever it was, okay, who was a hero of my father's, right, for writing that opinion, because it's an amazing blend of like, the law and medicine and, Supreme Court sort of opinion, etc. Anyway, he came to a
It was written,
con-
by the way, by Blackman.
Blackman, sorry. So he was invited to American Psychiatric Association, like, annual conference, right, to speak on Roe v. Wade. And my dad was like a vice president or something. He was a young, up and coming, guy, psychiatrist. Yeah, he eventually became president of the American Psychiatric Association. Anyway, so he's on the dais, but he wasn't really next to Blackman, right? And so Blackman gives his speech, and after his speech, he he's coming off the dais, and the president of the American Psychiatric Association introduces him to my father. He says, "This is this young, brilliant, bright psychiatrist, and he's a great fan of yours. He's written an article, and it's just been well received." So Blackman says to my father, "Oh, it's a pleasure to meet you. We're going into this, separate VIP room to smoke cigars. Would you like to join us?" And my father goes, "Oh, yeah, of course, I'd love to join you." He goes, "Okay, if you just grab my briefcase over there and bring it in, I'll meet you in there in a minute." And my dad goes, "I don't carry briefcases." And he walked away.
Wow.
So that was one example.
That's a great story.
Second example is that my dad was asked for the first and last time to be part of a federal commission, to study Waco. Waco is where the Branch
Davidian deaths, right?
Yeah, were there, and the FBI raided them, and then they set fire to they set off bombs, and they set fire, and all these people were killed, right? And there was a question about whether that was handled properly, and whether Janet Reno had done a good job, who was the attorney general. And so my father was on this, blue ribbon committee to investigate Waco. And about halfway through the investigation, he realized that it was just, an attempt to whitewash what happened and say that, Janet Reno acted, correctly and all this. So he decided to conduct his own investigation. So he started investigating the whole thing separately, not with the committee. All these people came and met with him, and ultimately he issued his own separate report from the committee, basically saying what he actually thinks happened, which of course did not endear him with the committee or with Phil Hines.
What was your father's opinion on it? I'm curious.
The FBI acted inappropriately, that Janet Reno did not properly assess the situation, that if you had psychiatrists and mental health professionals who were familiar with this type of situation, it could have been handled differently, and there would have been less loss of life, basically.
Yeah, there was 76 people died in that.
Yeah. So anyway, those are my two stories about me. So my dad is a very, independent thinking and demanding person. So he wasn't easy to, be his son. My brother, by the way, was the head of physics at Yale. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He went to Oxford. So I had a lot to compete with in my own family, forgetting my father. So my father and my brother are two of the smartest people that I've ever met.
It's like the Sherlock Holmes. He had Mycroft. Was it the name of his brother? Mycroft. That's it. Yes. Mycroft Holmes was the smart one.
Yeah,
and he was
Sherlock Holmes fan, by the way. But go ahead.
I am too. Big Sherlock Holmes. When I was a kid, we would watch Arthur Conan Doyle, the Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce films.
Yep.
I still watch those, believe it or not. And when I was a child, we actually listened. We had records, and the records were Basil Rathbone reading the original stories. And my older brother, who became a lawyer, we would listen to those at night. We'd plug it, crazy kids, right? We would, literally it was an LP record, and it was a professional recording of Basil Rathbone reading the actual stories. And
fascinating. Amazing voice, that guy. He was amazing.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think about what's going on at Harvard these days? I mean, just before we started the interview, you were telling me a little bit about the False Claims Act, which is what you and I have been doing for 30 years, and Harvard University, and the novel, and how the Trump administration did something has never been done before. I don't know if it's good or bad. I'm just saying it's never been done. You want to discuss that a bit?
So, one of the questions that we all had as trial lawyers, and particularly as whistleblower lawyers, was how is the Trump administration going to react to the False Claims Act, to whistleblower laws in general? One of the big proponents of the False Claims Act is a Republican. It's, Senator Grassley. And so we believe and take the position that this is not a political issue. Defrauding the government is something Democrats and Republicans should care about. But, we did not know how the Trump administration was going to react to it. It appears, at least at this point, that the Trump administration believes that the False Claims Act is an effective tool, not only to ferret out the normal types of fraud that we've been going after, Medicaid fraud, pharmaceutical companies, they're off-label marketing improperly drugs, or, defense contractors who are selling, $10,000 hammers or whatever it is. But to go after DEI and, whether or not colleges, organizations, law firms are properly implementing Trump's agenda and following the law the way Trump understands it. And the most recent example of this, as everybody knows, Trump has been going after universities. He went after Columbia University. He went after Harvard University. And Harvard University, I think, quite laudably said, we're going to stand up for ourselves, as opposed to some law firms that just kind of crumbled. And they said they were going to go to court and they were going to, defend themselves. Trump just in the last 2 days sent a letter to Harvard basically indicating that the Justice Department is going to investigate Harvard for failing to implement the appropriate, both the Supreme Court opinion that was recently, passed down on Harvard about how they had to hire, and also, how they had to admit students, but also, DEI, and that if they found that Harvard had not implemented those and had misrepresented that to the federal government, that they would pursue them under a False Claims Act theory for submitting false claims and seek all the money that Harvard had received under those programs back. So that just happened in the last couple of days.
Yeah, but how can they go backwards in time? In other words, from the day Trump issued an executive order, going from that day forward, I see the theory, but how can they go backwards in time for monies that were given last year and the year before?
I mean, I don't know the specifics of it, but I believe their position is, I don't remember when the Supreme Court decision against Harvard came down, but I think it came down 2 or 3 years ago. Some Asian student organization had sued Harvard, claiming that the way they were doing admissions was not appropriate, that they were using, quotas, things like that. So I think to the extent he could prove they weren't following that decision, but they were representing in documents they submitted to the government that they were complying with all federal laws, then maybe he could pursue.
So that could open up, in theory, that could open up a whole avenue of new whistleblower cases, if you think about it. If you work at a college that is applying DEI, let's say behind the scenes, and they take federal money under this administration, that might be actionable under the False Claims Act. We've never seen that before.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how judges are going to react to this. It's not something that I'm favorable towards.
Yeah, it
But whether
seems.
or not it technically could be pursued under the False Claims Act, I mean, it could technically be, but I
Yeah,
don't know how judges are going to respond. I mean, the False Claims Act is, a very complicated and, it's like a tree that in 1986, these amendments, they amended it. Before that, they didn't do much with it. And after they amended it, the courts have crafted onto this tree so many exceptions and so many branches, mainly usually to try to get rid of False Claims Act cases more than to encourage them, that it's like a thicket to get through it with a court, no matter what the base of your original allegation is. So,
I mean, the complexity of false claims cases today, and it's so difficult to do it well, which is, I can't stress how important it is that your lawyer knows. There's no other way to teach it. It's not, you can't learn it in law school. You just have to have, in my opinion, lots of experience. And I think the people out there who have the most experience at it are the better lawyers. Firms like Phillips and Cohn, they started the modern False Claims Act. I think you are. I think I'm experienced. I just think we've seen when I talk to other lawyers about the False Claims Act, I'll just say it's not that I'm smart. I've just been around for 30 years and I've seen every possibility of what can go wrong. And I think you learn best from things that go wrong.
well, see, I think the thing about the False Claims Act, it's like an iceberg, right? The False Claims Act statute is what you see above the water, but there's so much that goes on underneath the water that's not necessarily written down anywhere, or it's written internally in memoranda of the DOJ that only certain lawyers of us know about. There's, knowing which offices in which districts are supportive of what kinds of False Claims Act cases. So, I mean, you could have the best False Claims Act case in the world, but if you go to the wrong district,
Place, go to the wrong
end
district,
up with the wrong judge.
the wrong agency, the wrong district, the wrong judge.
I mean, for example, so there's a number of legally constructed roadblocks to the False Claims Act, which have some basis in the actual statute, but which courts and defendants counsel have seized upon, right, to get False Claims Act cases thrown out. One of those is, that you've got to allege a fraud with specificity, right? So you can't just say, at some point between 2002 and 2008, a bunch of claims that said this were submitted to the government. That's not good enough, right? You've got to give times, you got to give more specifics, all of this. Now, they call that Rule 9B under the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, which applies to the False Claims Act because that applies to a fraud count claim. So some states and some districts, and some federal circuits, as we call them, you have to be incredibly detailed in order to get a complaint past a judge in that circuit, right? You have to know at the very day that the claim was submitted, you got to know who submitted the claim. You got to know, sometimes you even have to have copies of the claim. Now, how many people?
How many people in an organization?
Billing department, right?
Other than the
They happen
billing.
to know about the fraud and they happen to be in the billing department, right? Are going to actually have that information. It's very unlikely you're going to have that information.
And what people don't, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so if you file a complaint in these circuits, there's probably 5 of them, it's going to get dismissed if the judge is following the law of that circuit.
And if you can get past the agency too, the agency's a problem. We both had cases where the conduct was egregious, people got hurt or people died. The U.S. attorney liked the case, wanted to do the case, but the U.S. attorney, people don't understand what the role of U.S. attorney is. The U.S. attorney represents a particular agency of the government that you're alleging was defrauded. So if the agency's Medicare or Medicaid or the FDA, which is a big one, and the U.S. attorney says, yeah, this seems like an interesting case. It seems like a righteous case, as we say. But the FDA says, we don't want it. We don't care about that case. We don't want to enforce that case. We want to resolve that matter behind the scenes without making a lawsuit out of it. Then you lose your case. Now, people don't realize how much goes into investigating one of these cases.
So, I mean, the FDA is the perfect example, right? Because the FDA has so much capture. Essentially, the pharmaceutical companies that the FDA regulates, many of them end up hiring the people that work for the FDA, or those people worked for the pharmaceutical companies before they come to the FDA. So there's this very close relationship between the FDA and pharmaceutical companies. And the FDA also doesn't want to look like it has egg on its face. So it doesn't want to look like, oh, we approve this drug and now it's out there killing people. Jesus, we don't want that to come out, right? We don't want people to know that we screwed up. So, and this happens also with the military, I hate to say, but when, a lot of times I brought a bunch of cases involving military contractors. I had one that I told you, Joe, went to the Supreme Court of the United States against Halliburton. And it's amazing how the military does not want to pursue these things.
Now, it didn't help you that the former CEO of the company was the vice president of the United States at the time.
No, it didn't help at all.
Yeah.
So
talk about your Halliburton. I was just going to mention that these cases, people think you just find a false claims lawyer on the internet, tell your story, and then bags of money fall out of the sky. That ain't the case. And in the case of Halliburton, I remember when you told me you were taking on that case. The one thing that we have to mention here is that the defense lawyers, normally your targets are defense companies or drug companies, right? And they have as much money as they want. They print money and they hire the best lawyers. And I remember at one point, I think it was during the Medco case, where the law firm for the other side was saying that they were billing $3 million a month to settle. When that case was in the end stages getting settled, it was $3 million a month in legal fees that the company was paying to the defense lawyers. Mm-hmm. So you had a case against Halliburton. What was the case about? And then you ended up in front of the Supreme Court of all places, right?
Yes. So
which had to be a defining moment of your career.
Our case, it definitely was the highlight of my career. I mean, what's so funny is I go to these conferences, legal conferences or whatever, and I meet these heads of Paul Weiss and, Proskauer and, major law firms, that you think of when you think of the biggest law firms in the country. And, I say to them, oh, so when I was in the Supreme Court and I argued this case, and they're like, you were in the Supreme Court. You got to argue a case. You don't get that. It's a very closed system. A lot, because I was a plaintiff's lawyer and my client was supportive of my doing it, and our law firm helped support it, obviously, as well as we got other support, I was able to do that. But usually when you get to that level, they want people that do nothing but argue in the Supreme Court.
But can you tell us what the case was about?
Yeah, so what it was about was the failure to filter water in Iraq. What Halliburton was supposed to do, it was supposed to set up these filtration systems to filter water from, this polluted water that was in the war zones where they were fighting, so that the troops could wash with it, clean dishes with it, not really drink it. I mean, sometimes, but mainly not that. And they weren't doing it. In some cases, they didn't even have the equipment there. In some cases, the equipment didn't work. And yet they were billing 12 hours a day, every day, for doing this. And we had the hardest time. The military just did not want to pursue this case, and we were like, how can you not want to pursue this? You exposed these troops to serious disease, right? They were basically showering with like all kinds of bacteria in the water and things that could have killed them, and you don't care, but that's what we got. In fact, this is the amazing part, Joe. They told us we can't find anybody that will say, that was material to them, that they actually weren't filtering it or whatever. So we actually went to the location where the military does this contracting and they review, the invoices. And we got somebody to give us an affidavit that said, yeah, I would care about that. Brought that to the Department of Justice and I said, okay, you couldn't find anybody. We found somebody. And they said, we still don't care. So, yeah. But anyway, my case was like literally a law school exam, right? Everything that happened in my case is, the most far out sort of things that can happen to you with respect to all the various aspects of the statute, because we had all these defense lawyers up against us with, unlimited funds, and they made every possible argument they could make. They made an argument about first to file. They made an argument about statute of limitations. They made arguments about, original source. Every argument that
they can afford to.
They made, and the judge, who really didn't want this case for whatever reason, I mean, maybe Halliburton had some, relationship with him, basically bought off on anything these defendants would file, and then we would have to take it up to the circuit court and get the circuit court to reverse it, and this went on and on and on, and ultimately, we actually ended up having the district court hold that our own case was first to file as to our own case, which I think is the first time that ever happened, right? So what happened is the district court...
And you were barred by your own case?
Yeah, we were barred by our own case.
That's what you got to... When you say first to file, people understand that in the False Claims Act, it's a race to the courthouse. Not 100%, but in general, the first person to file those allegations with the government will trump any, to coin a phrase, to beat out any other or be successful over any subsequent cases that get filed on the same topic. But what you're saying is that you basically outdid yourself, that you barred yourself because of a case you filed. How is that possible?
Right. So what the court said, this is the unbelievable. This is how crazy.
That seems insane. That just seems.
I mean,
unhinged.
we won. We ultimately got this thrown out. But
okay.
What the court said was, okay, I dismissed your case, right, without prejudice, right? So I gave you the right to refile it, right? But during that time period that we were putting together the case to refile, the time to appeal our case ran, right? So we appealed his decision because, we didn't want to waive that right, right? So we had appealed the decision. So our appeal was there. And then the deadline to file the amended complaint came up. And so we said, okay, we're going to file the amended complaint. We went to dismiss our appeal, right? Which we have the absolute right to do because the defendants had done nothing at this point, right? The defendants opposed our right to dismiss the appeal, right? Even though they had no legal right to do that, right? And then they moved. Then when we had to file our amended complaints, we filed our amended complaint. And then they moved to dismiss our amended complaint on the ground that there was a pre-existing case pending when we filed our amended complaint, even though it was our case.
How is that? What does the judge say when they file something so stupid?
He says they're right, and he dismissed our case.
That's
so
insane.
We had to appeal it to the D.C. Circuit, who reversed that.
And thank God that they reversed it.
Yeah.
But eventually, look, all of this is interesting, but the overarching principle is that when you're suing in a false claims case, you're fighting an uphill battle against somebody with much more money, and they can do this for years and just years and years. That's why it's so important to get an intervention. I think,
I was about,
because intervention means that you file a case, the government looks at your case, privately investigates it themselves, then they come to the realization that your case was righteous, as we say, and then they join your case. So now it's not you versus the defendant, it's the United States of America and you versus the defendant. And those are the cases that are easier. Now, that said, we've had cases that were declined by the government for reasons other than the fact that they didn't have merit. Lots of, not politics, just assets. Even the government, the government has to allocate their assets, right? So they can't just throw investigators and all these assets at every case that comes across their desk. So sometimes you'll get a case which is worthy, but the government says, no, we decline. Right. And then what happens in that case? You want to explain what happens in that case?
Sure. So the QUITAM, or the False Claims Act, has a very interesting provision, which isn't in hardly any other statutes, which gives the whistleblower and his counsel the right to continue to litigate a case on behalf of the government, even if the government doesn't intervene in the case, which means it doesn't take over the case. And in fact, 80% of the cases or more that are filed with the government doesn't intervene in, for many different reasons. The government really likes to have a lay down case, right? Like they don't want to take a case to the litigation stage if they think there's a potential they're going to lose it, or if it's going to make bad law for them, right? So the government, many times there'll be a case where the government says to us, we know you're good lawyers, we've worked with you in the past, we're not going to get into this case, you litigate it if you want, and then, if you find the information in discovery, maybe we'll come back in, but, we just don't feel comfortable, coming in at this point for a lot of, there could be many different reasons, including political reasons, So that doesn't mean the case isn't a good case. So, so there's a very small percentage of whistleblower lawyers, our law firm, and I guess your law firm being one of them, that do try these cases. We're trial lawyers and we pursue the cases to trial. We have recovered, and lawyers have recovered substantial amounts of money for the government and for whistleblowers in those cases. But of course, they're much more expensive. They're much harder to win. And getting back to your point, the best way to prevail in a False Claims Act case is to convince the government that you have a really good case, that they should intervene, to give them as much help in putting the case together from as early on as you can, identify witnesses, give them documents, give them legal arguments. You can even, in some jurisdictions, they'll even let you help, propose subpoenas to get documents, or interrogatories. So the more more you can do that, and the more you have a lawyer who's got the experience to do that, the more likelihood you're going to persuade the government to intervene, which is by far the most preferable.
And I think in unlike some other areas of law, in false claims cases, you want to get an intervention if you can. And one of the big decision makers that the government applies, even though they won't tell this to people, I believe, is the experience of the law firm that filed the case. I think that if success breeds success in the false claims space, and if you look at the settlements, I forget one time there's an organization and they looked at 20% of the firms made 80% of the money. It's some number like that. But the reason that is because if you're the Department of Justice and you're fresh out of, Harvard Law School or Yale Law School, and you went to work for the AUSA, and you've got a pile of cases sitting on your desk, well, you want the help of a law firm that's got some depth, ability to try a case. You know what I do, and I just read one recently. I read a dismissed complaint, a declined complaint that was written by somebody, some lawyer, and I won't say who, but I looked at it. Now I know what's going on at that company. I have like 4 or 5 allegations that I'm currently working up against that company. And I looked at this whistleblower complaint, and it was an amateur complaint. I mean, it should have never been filed, and
So,
it got declined.
so Joe, what I would say is that there was a period of time, 1986 till about early 2000s, where there was probably about 30 firms that did this. My firm, one of them.
Yeah, max 30. I think
Well,
30 is
look,
generous.
I was sitting at a table with 8 people. The Taxpayers Against Fraud, which is the organization of these lawyers, that was formed by Phillips and Cohn right after, very soon after the 1986 amendments. For a while, we were meeting in one room, and there were 8 of us. And then, within, by 2000, a lot of class action law firms and other sort of smaller plaintiffs' lawyers saw these big recoveries, which obviously is a small percentage of the cases that are filed. And they were like, oh, we got to get into this, right? And all of a sudden, all these firms were claiming to be False Claims Act whistleblower lawyers. They didn't have experience, they didn't know what they were doing. And so all these complaints have proliferated. And of course, the government is not happy about it because they have to investigate them, and, they don't want to make bad law and all that. So getting back to your point of like 20 firms having 80% of the recoveries, that's because the 20% firms know what they're doing, right? Not only
100%.
they're picking the right cases that are
I
likely to
think
be
it's
failed,
twofold. I think
and
you're
that
right.
have the ability to recover them.
100%. I think you're right. The firms are smarter, so they're not filing junk. But also, I think on the other side of the equation, the U.S. attorneys tend to acclimate towards those firms because they don't file junk. And
So that's
I want to
true.
work right. And the the cases themselves, like you said, you're saying there were 30 firms. Now, if you Google false claims firm, you're going to get 200 hits, and you don't have any idea. And one of the things, when I was just a consultant, people would say to me, "Why do I even need to hire a consultant?" And I said, because there's, let's say, 50 firms out there. I know intimately what's going on at half of those firms, intimately, like who's in the game, who just got a divorce, who's alcoholic and was. I won't say who, but I actually had a lawyer once. I had to go to a lockdown ward to go talk to my lawyer about an ongoing case because he was locked in a psych unit, and his law firm didn't know it, and I never breached that confidence. But the point is,
I think I know who
I've
that
been
is.
around. If you're around for
I
30
won't
years,
promote it.
it wasn't you, but if
No,
you've
it
been
wasn't.
around. But if you've been around as long as I have, you get to see everything twice, right? So you kind of know what's going on. Now, these are really complex. And I want to talk to you about 2 things. I know that you had a case against AOL. That was a jury trial. But overall, why don't you combine 2 things? Tell us about the AOL trial, and then sort of weave in your philosophy of litigating cases. Like, what is your general philosophy when you approach these cases?
I wrote the brief that said that the black bag was not, admissible. The black bag.
Yeah, the black bed where they had the needles and the insulin.
So what I did is I went to Harvard Law Library, and I was reading like cases from like the 1860s and
Wow.
19, because what happened was, I don't know if you remember that case, but the state of Rhode Island hired a private prosecutor to prosecute Von Bulow. And he was a prosecutor who had done the abscam cases. If you remember the abscam cases.
I know the FBI agent that ran the abscam investigation. worked at the Milberg law firm when Mel Weiss was there. And then I just know him. And it was a funny story about that, just so you know.
Yeah.
One of the Abscam congressmen,
Yeah.
I was at a fundraiser with Stephen Weiss from Seeger Weiss. And it was a fundraiser for some candidate. And the congressman, I think it was from Staten Island, who had been convicted in the Abscam case. As I recall, there was a congressman from the Abscam case. And I was standing next to the lawyer, to the FBI agent who worked for the firm, right, Mel's firm, who ran Abscam for the FBI when he was at the FBI. They introduced both of us to the congressman. And then the congressman says to the FBI agent, "You look familiar. Have I met you before?" And he walked away very quickly, the FBI agent. And I caught up with him on the other side. It's a big cocktail room, a lot of people bumping into each other. I said, "How do you know him?" He said, "I was the FBI agent who was undercover that made the tapes on him and recorded him." He was just so old at that point, the congressperson. He was retired, that he didn't remember. The guy that he was shaking hands with was the FBI agent that put him away. So anyway, a little Abscam humor there.
We all are like, what is it, 6 degrees of Abscam. but so anyway, what happened was that guy, that private prosecutor, hired a private detective to go into the summer home of the Von Bülows, and that private detective found the black bag, right? And gave the black bag, which had the insulin into it, which was part of the evidence that was used against Von Bülow, to the private prosecutor, who then used it to prosecute Von Bülow. And the question was, does that violate the Fourth Amendment, right? And so I found a case in which, like, Clarence Darrow was the lawyer, in which they said that a private prosecutor acts on behalf of the state, and therefore, if the private prosecutor violates the Fourth Amendment, it's violation.
So it was a Fourth Amendment violation.
Yeah, and so it went up to the Rhode Island Supreme Court, and they reversed the conviction of Von Bülow on that ground. My claim to fame. Anyway, so I then worked with Larry Tribe, who is one of the best constitutional law lawyers from Harvard, on a couple of cases. I represented Reverend Sun Young Moon, if you remember him, in a tax case. And so, I sort of learned his way of approaching the law. He was a brilliant guy. He had eidetic memory, Larry Tribe. He could remember a page number, a citation from an appendix, like, while he was in the middle of the oral argument, he would cite, that's on page blank at, line 6. So he was amazing. Then I worked with Herb Stern, who was a former federal court judge in New Jersey, a former U.S. attorney in New Jersey. In the Attorney General's office in New York, he actually prosecuted Malcolm X's killers, not he investigated Malcolm X's.
Wow. Yeah, I was up on Audubon Avenue yesterday, and I said to my wife, "This is where Malcolm X was killed." The old vestige of the Audubon, I guess that's what they called it, the auditorium. Yeah. That's where he was murdered.
Yep. So anyway, and I would say that Herb Stern was a big influence on my legal career and my approach to the law. His approach was very much about the integrity of the lawyer, the integrity of your case, and do not make arguments that are inconsistent with each other, which was a big thing in law school, right? They always taught you, like, make every possible argument. If you don't think this, then, how about this, right? And the example that Herb Stern, former Judge Stern, used to always give me, he said, look, if somebody says, I wasn't there at the time this person was murdered, So I'm innocent. But if I was there, it's self-defense. You know,
I was
that's like,
there.
that's essentially what these things are like, right? But because they're more sophisticated and subtle, the people making the arguments don't realize that they're basically undercutting their own argument. You know what I'm saying? So that's why, and I know this is a really stupid rule, but he taught me that you never say, but even if, right? You never say, this is my argument. But even if that's wrong, here's another argument, right? You always say, moreover, moreover. I know this sounds stupid, but actually it's a really good rule. So you say, you know, he was, innocent of the crime. Moreover, their evidence even isn't even sufficient to convict him if he was there. You know what I'm saying? Like
Oh, I know exactly what you're saying. I actually spoke to a lawyer once, and he was very well known. I'm not going to say his name, but he defends the Chinese government in all these kickback cases when they do contracts all over the world. And it was for Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. He was a defense lawyer. So the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act basically says that if you have any financial interest in the United States and then you use bribery to get your contracts, even if it didn't happen in the U.S., that you're liable here for damages under the SEC and all these issues. But what he said to me was, I get paid to do, here's what I get paid to do. I get paid to say, when the government discovers the bribe, I paid to say, it never happened. But if it did happen, we certainly didn't authorize it. And if we didn't authorize it, we didn't know about it. And if we knew about it, it wasn't to the extent that you found out. And if to the extent that you found out we have any liability, we might pay it to make it, but we didn't know about it. And he says it's like peeling away an onion. And at one point you just pay. But that's how he did that all day long. And he did that for years and years. And he said, I really would like to come in on the plaintiff's side because I'm tired of defending China. That's what he said to me. But when I showed him that on the plaintiff's side, we work on contingency basically. And you have to actually wait for your money, as you know. He just couldn't handle it, but it was amazing. It really drove home to me that, I could never be a defense lawyer for that reason. I just couldn't work for these companies defending them against some of the things that they do. Chinese bribery is low on the list of the horrible things I've seen. The pharma stuff is high on the list of the stuff I've seen.
No, I'm not completely a plaintiff's lawyer. I do defend some cases, but I always defend cases. I always tell a client, I'll defend you on the facts and get you the best result I can get you. But if you want somebody that's just going to delay the case inevitably and hope that the other side, gives up.
Yeah, well, when I first met you, you were doing all kinds of things. You weren't doing just false claims. You worked with David Boies.
Yes.
And then you did something with the New York Yankees. That's what I found the most fascinating thing. What did you do with the Yankees?
I was the general counsel to a company called the Yankee Nets that owned the Yankees, the Nets, and the New Jersey Devils. So they owned all those teams. And, of course, George Steinbrenner didn't, acknowledge that, that they owned the Yankees, but they did. So, and I was responsible for all the legal issues that came up, including a major lawsuit, which is where I met David Boies, where we were co-counsel to sue Madison Square Garden to get back the television rights for the Yankees. So, and then David Boies asked me to join his firm, and I became the head of his New Jersey office. So David Boies and I did a number of major cases together, and I was about to get to him. He was the other major influence on my approach. What I learned though is all of these very incredibly talented trial lawyers, they have a style. You can't imitate their style because you're not them.
You're not them.
You need to figure out what your own style is and then adapt things from what they do to the extent it fits within your own style, right? Herb Stern what they used to call him when he was a judge. They called him the Prince of Darkness, and
Why is that?
he was very intimidating. He was
Okay.
very intimidating, and that was part of it. But he did it quiet. It was quiet intimidation, right? He had an amazing charisma in a room, and he would just stare at people, and they break down. I'm not going to do that. I'm not Herb Stern, right? David Boies. What I loved about David Boies is he would make the case seem so simple, right? And rather than arguing like vociferously or loudly, like we're right and they're wrong, he would make an argument where the jury would go, yeah, that has to be right. Like it's like it was almost like the jury would be coming to its own conclusion. He wouldn't even be persuading them, which is an amazing talent. And it takes tremendous skill because you've got to understand the case completely. You have to simplify the case, right? And then you have to be able to argue it in a way where you kind of take the emotion out of it and make it just a logical conclusion,
He
right?
has an amazing way of retaining data, and I've met him like through you a number of times, and he's just it's funny, you meet somebody like that, and then you're impressed at how soft spoken they are. He's not one of these guys who yells and screams and bangs his fist on the table and does all of that kind of stuff. Just the opposite, right? He's like Mr. Logical.
Yeah.
And wasn't he involved, and I think you as well, in that AIG that was that the largest civil settlement in the history of New York, the AIG settlement?
It was a judgment. It wasn't a
Judgment?
settlement.
No, it's a judgment rather. Was that the
Yeah.
largest ever?
Yeah, it's one of the largest. So what happened there, okay, David and I, more David than me, but I was part of it. We represented Hank Greenberg in connection with his separation from AIG. And this is actually I mean, we had many different cases that all came out of that. We had a case against the federal government where we claimed, the federal government came in and took over AIG unlawfully, unconstitutionally, and sold off parts of AIG that they shouldn't have sold off, and damaged shareholders. I had a large intellectual property case involving this company called Star, which was created by Star was the name of the guy who created AIG, and Hank Greenberg was kind of his German scientist who, turned AIG into what it was, and the two of them created this company called Star, and it was a bunch of like insurance brokerage companies that were worth a lot of money, and Hank Greenberg used the stock in those companies as kind of a way to compensate employees in AIG, right? So when you got to a real senior level of AIG and you became like a vice president, he would say, "Congratulations, you're now going to get 5% of this Star company," right? But in fact, he owned Star. AIG had no interest in Star, right? And there was no agreements or anything to do this, right? So when AIG, parted ways with Hank Greenberg, he said, "Okay, that's the end of Star. You don't get any more Star stock." And they sued him. It was worth like $2 billion. And they sued him saying, "No, well, you've been doing this for 30 years. We have a constructive trust. You have to keep doing this. This isn't something that you just get to stop doing." So we had a trial about it, and we won.
But that was at the time, I think, one of the biggest judgments in the state of New York ever to that point.
It was. I think it was. And getting back to my AOL case, so that case. So I do one of the things that I do a lot of is intellectual property, particularly patent infringement, copyright infringement, trademark infringement, things like that. And I'm the trial lawyer. I'm the person that takes the complex facts, turns them into, understandable arguments for a judge and a jury, and, pursues the case. Most many patent lawyers are not trial lawyers. They don't have a lot of litigation experience. They're very technical, and they really just look at all the very technical arguments that you can make about whether the patent is valid or invalid, that kind of thing, right? But as a trial lawyer, you got to understand what a jury is going to care about, right? So I have something, now you're asking me about my trial philosophy. I have a trial philosophy. I call it the strategic strike philosophy, which is try a case, litigate a case in the most efficient way possible. And the way you do that is you identify what your story is going to be. What is the compelling reason that ultimately the government or the jury or the judge is going to rule for you? And then everything you do in the case should be focused on that. And so all the other things that the defendants are doing, because most defense lawyers just do everything they can think of, they don't have this kind of approach. You just, as efficiently as possible, fend that off and just tell that story to the judge in everything that you file, right? From the beginning of the first document you file with the judge to when you make discovery motions, you tell the story again. So the judge is repeatedly exposed to this story. And as you get more and more evidence, you can, build up the story and support what you've been saying all along. So by the time you get to a summary judgment motion or a trial, the judge knows your case, right?
Right. And if you win on that point, you win the whole case.
Yeah. And the idea is, you want to make that decision when you really know what you're doing, but you want to make it as early in the case as you can, so you can continually, consistently focus on that instead of
Is that how you won the AOL case?
Yes. So what I did with the AOL case, and by the way, all the patent lawyers that were my co-counsel said, absolutely not, do not do this, right? Because they're so afraid of their own shadows, right? So what I did is I said to them, okay, this is a piece of software that you have a patent on. This is the client had a patent, and what it did is that it filtered content on the internet. This was very early on when the internet was at a very, very early stage.
It was for the teachers. It wasn't for the
No,
schools.
no, it was just to allow somebody to choose what websites their children could go to and what websites they couldn't, what websites students could go to, what websites they couldn't. Okay. So AOL, we sued a bunch of companies, but we ended up trying the case against AOL. We settled with the other ones. They had something, it was called like parental controls, right? And I don't know if you remember AOL and the frisbees that everybody threw around. You would get those things in the mail, and they would be like these discs, right? Put them into your huge sort of computer thing, and it would allow you to get on AOL, right? So they had this thing, and what it did was they had these like whitelist and blacklists, right? A whitelist means you can go to it. A blacklist means you can't go to it, right? And so with their parental controls, that's what they were doing. But after our client did filed his patent, right, and developed this software, they magically changed their parental controls to say, oh, now with this new software we have, this new parental controls, you can eliminate sites, right? Or you can add sites to your list, right?
That's what they do today. That's what parental controls are basically today.
Right. Okay. So they were claiming we just got that idea, right? It had nothing to do with this patent. We're not infringing that patent. AOL has all these brilliant people that work for AOL. This guy's some pissant that lives in Long Island. and I took that position through the whole case, no settlement, nothing. Right. Okay. So what I said is, okay, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. I said this to my client, right? You tell me this. What is it that the AOL couldn't do, right? Before you filed, before you came up with this patent, you came up with this software. And so we came up with these 3 things. One of them was, an example would be, okay, your son gets an assignment to do a paper on the president. Okay, there was a website called whitehouse.com,
Okay.
which was a porn site.
Oh my God.
And
Really?
which,
That's
yeah,
funny.
and which, in fact, I think Obama or something. So the person that owned whitehouse.com owned it for like 15 years. And at one point, Obama or the Clintons or somebody tried to get him to like shut it down. He refused to do it. They tried to buy it. He wouldn't sell it to them. And then he started like putting their pictures on it.
Oh my God.
But in any event, the point is, if you go in and you search about the White House and the president, whitehouse.com would come up. Your son would see this really graphic, pornographic stuff, right? So I said, okay, so if this happened, could AOL's parental controls help the parent, like, ensure that he couldn't go to whitehouse.com? And the answer was no, right? And then I asked every witness in the case this question, right? So
Yeah.
I opened with this and I
You
asked
close.
every witness in the case this question, right?
Huh.
And the answer was they hired some third party administrator, right, to create the black and white lists. And therefore, it took 3 days. It took 3 days. So if you wanted them to add or take off something off the white list, it took them 3 days to do it, right? And they wouldn't take it off unless they were taking off everybody in the country's white list, right? They didn't have like white lists for one person. You know what I'm saying? So they really couldn't do anything about this, right? Is the bottom line. Okay. Then I had another question. It was like, your son wants to play in a soccer, he's got a soccer game for his school, right? And he wants to find out where the school is, and information about the school so he can go to the soccer game. If you have a whitelist, you can't do it, right? Because you can only go to the sites that they allow you to go
That
to.
they allowed you to
If
go
that
to.
school is not on that list, you can't do it, right?
So you couldn't add to the list on
Right.
your own.
Right. So there was a third one. I forget what it was, but it was to show what they couldn't do, right? And the other thing I did is I accused them of intentionally stealing the patent, right? Which, if you intentionally steal a patent, intentionally infringe a patent, that allows for additional damages and it allows for, attorney's fees, things like that. Okay. And they were like, all the other patent lawyers were like, well, we don't want to do that. That's like a really high bar, right? And I said, yeah, but the point is, even if they don't find that they intentionally stole the patent, we still win. They find that they infringed the patent, right? So what happened was, first of all, the whole case was about my 3 questions, right? Like which I opened with. Every witness I asked, every time the lawyer on the other side got up, he was trying to prove that they could do the 3 things.
Right. So you basically frame the argument.
Yeah. And then the funniest thing was, they called a witness, right? When it was their turn to call their case, and they called a witness to try to show that they didn't intentionally steal the patent, right? And he got up and he gave this testimony, how brilliant they were, and then this is what they did, and this is what they were doing, and he had run the division or whatever. And then on cross-examination, I like asked him 3 questions. And the first one was like, when did you leave that department? And he had left the department, right, before a document that I had, which had the patent on it. In other words, they had done patent searches when they were getting ready to file patents for their software, and it had our patent on it. And he was like, I've never seen that before. So, I mean, it was like, you're right. I basically tailored the case to my case. And they were so busy trying to like disprove what I was doing. Their whole defense was like in disarray because of that.
No, it's pretty creative. And it's creative and it's old school at the same time. And I think it's really fun. I think the one problem with trials is that they run amok and they can take on a life of their own. And what you're talking about is framing the entire argument from open to close so that even when they're arguing against your points, it's your argument that you picked.
Yep.
So you're not letting them introduce all these tangential facts that can confuse a jury or a judge. You walk in with a plan, you focus on it, you execute it, and more often than not, you win as a result of it. And I think that's, it's creative and it's, what's the right word? It's creative and it's focused and it gets the job done. And I think you're right. A lot of lawyers don't take control like that. I think the great ones do. I think people like Boyce do that. I think they can take very complex issues, make it simple. Now, for fun, I know a lot about you. You mentioned that you were a soccer player. I know as an adult you played soccer until. Are you still playing soccer or did you stop?
I still play soccer. Yeah, I do.
You were in the Maccabee games for a while, weren't you?
I was in the Maccabee games for about 10 years.
And that's the Israeli version of the Olympic Games for people out there who don't know what that is. Mm-hmm. And we both actually have something in common, you much more than me. I raised 3 girls for my own 3, and then 2 for another family. All of them were SAG equity. They were in Actors Equity and all that. But you've had you're still doing it. Tell us about the other David boys. And I don't mean the guy who produced Wicked on Broadway.
The other David Stone? Do you want to know about the other David Stone or the other?
No, I want to know about you because there's 2
actually,
David Stones.
There is another David boys.
There is.
And another David Stone.
That's crazy. So tell us, how did you tell me what you do and how you got involved in it all?
I've always loved film. I'm a film fanatic.
That's where you wanted to start out originally.
I talked about I tried to go to Stanford School. So when I was the general counsel of the Yankee Nets, I got to meet all these people in the entertainment industry. And, through those contacts, I got involved with making some films or investing in some films at the time. And then I also got involved with doing off-Broadway shows. I did an off-Broadway show called Frankenstein the Musical.
I remember it was interesting. Frankenstein the Musical. It just seems like a strange name for a show, but it was a good show.
Yeah, well, and then Young Frank. So the story, my story about that, I don't want to get too far into it, but we had already decided to bring Frankenstein the Musical. We were bringing it off Broadway, and then we were going to go to Broadway. And then Mel Brooks, in his way, decided, hey, I did so well with producers. Why don't I do something with Young Frankenstein? And like within 6 months, wrote it, cast it, including with like 2 people that were in our cast that dropped out of our musical, so that we were actually doing this musical off Broadway at the exact same time as Mel Brooks was doing.
Yeah, that's hard competition. It's hard to compete with Mel Brooks.
But the only good thing, Joe, is that a lot of people mistakenly went to our play. So thought they were going to Young Frankenstein. This doesn't seem very funny.
That's funny.
But so we did get back at him that way. So anyway, I did that. And then I got very involved with Sundance. and I was asked to be on some boards with Sundance and to help like young filmmakers and directors and things work on films. And I started working with those filmmakers, and I was involved in making Won't You Be My Neighbor, a documentary about Mr. Rogers, which did quite well and I'm very proud of. And more recently, Social Dilemma, which was about how bad social media is for us, which I totally agree with, which also did well. It won an Emmy. And then recently, I've been involved with Our Town, which was just recently on Broadway with Jim Parsons. And I'm also involved with the Al Pacino movie that's going to be coming out, which is about King Lear, called Lear Rex. So I am pretty involved now in both theater and film, and I find it not only really exciting and enjoyable, but also there's a lot. I find that the less narrow you are as a lawyer, the better off you are, right? So you'd be surprised that you get clients through this. You also get ideas for cases, and so I don't see anything in my life as like compartmentalized. I see it all relating.
Oh yeah. Now the King Lear movie, is it still called Lear Rex? Is that the name of it?
Yeah, Lear Rex, and it's going.
And what is it? It's a modern adaptation of King Lear.
So Al Pacino plays King Lear, and then Jessica Chastain is in it. Peter Dinklage from Game of Thrones is in it. He plays the Fool. So it's not a modern version. It's a pretty kind of adaptation that's pretty close to the original, except for it's got a framing device that takes place in modern times. So it's a little bit different in that respect.
And when is that set to come out?
So we're looking at trying to bring it to the Venice Film Festival in the fall. But we've also had some bidding on it from Apple and other streamers, and depending on whether they bid enough money, then we might, let them decide where we premiere it. But eventually there's going to be a New York premiere, probably in early, 2026.
So is it in post-production still, or is it canned?
No, it's done. It's been filmed. I went to watch the filming, which was quite interesting, in LA. So,
so you had a screening in Los Angeles?
No, I actually watched them film it.
You watched them film it.
I was
Okay.
there during the filming. Yeah,
But it hasn't had an official screening yet. The first screening is going to be in Venice, you think?
No, I've seen parts of it. I haven't even seen the whole film yet. But it's it's going to be, the premiere will be in the fall, and probably late fall or early of next year.
Didn't Al Pacino make a documentary once about making King Lear? Or am I correct? There was a documentary about him
being obsessed with King Lear,
right,
and Shakespeare in general, but in particular playing King Lear, and he always wanted to make a film about King Lear. He was in a film, I can't remember if it's a film or a play, based on Salome. And
I saw that. Actually, I went to see that. That was great, but that was one of these. I don't know what you call it. There were no costumes. It was a very low budget.
Chastain,
Marissa Tomei.
Okay, so Jessica Chastain was the one that played it in the version that I'm familiar with, and that's where he met Jessica Chastain. And then they decided that they would try to do King Lear. And then Bernard Rose, whose big claim to fame is that he did the movie Candyman, which is actually I
love that movie.
Very interesting movie.
I'm a big fan of Candyman. I think that's a great movie.
There you go. So he's directing this, and
oh wow,
he's a great director. So Al Pacino is very fond of him.
Yeah, I just think that Pacino always liked King Lear, and I think there was a documentary I saw once years ago where they just followed him around, and he was doing it somewhere, and they just basically it was somebody with a handheld camera and just followed Al Pacino around for a week. And that's what it was. But it was still fascinating. I mean, he also did Merchant of Venice, which he's done a few times on Broadway.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Actually, so funny story that my co-producer Eric Falkenstein told me is that he's been trying to get Al to go back on Broadway, and he said to Al, "Oh, we've got this great vehicle for you, Al, and we could do it on Broadway." And Al said, "I'm not 70 anymore."
No, it's once, I had a daughter, she went to New York University. All my kids did theater. And I just wanted to try to see how hard it would be to do a monologue, just to see if my brain could handle it. So I picked a monologue that Al Pacino did. I had just seen him in Merchant of Venice. And, the merchant's got all these monologues, right? And the great lines, a great show. And this thing was about a paragraph long. And I took a week to try to memorize it. And after a week, I hadn't accomplished the first two sentences. And I just said, well, I don't know how this guy does it. And I think when I saw him on Broadway, he had to be 70 years old. And I was exhausted just watching him. He's throwing himself around. It's really physical. People don't understand it.
He puts a lot of physical exertion into his role.
Yeah, I mean, and he's in his 80s now, right? He's 83 years. Yeah, so
he's got a young wife and a young child, so
they all do, but he's an amazing guy. I met him once in my life. It was the highlight of my life. He said to me, I looked at him and we were like, I have a picture of us standing side by side, and he just said, "We look like cousins." That's what he said.
You look very much alike. I should say, by the way, that you are not exaggerating about the theatrical and musical ability of your family, because my wife, Jenny, and I do, cabarets. And your daughter has been in, I think, 2 of them.
My daughter sang for you. I did.
And she was very, very good. So
yeah. One of the best Dave Stone comments of all time was when my oldest daughter, who's a tremendously talented girl, but she sang for something and for you, and it was like you were in the audience or something, and you came up to her afterwards and you said, because you're a demanding guy, right? And I said, you said something to her, and then you walked away, and I said, what did he say to you? Did he like it? He said, I didn't embarrass myself. And I said, that's a Dave Stone compliment. I said, that's a great compliment coming
with my clients and with everyone.
No, that was a great compliment. She remembers it to this day. It was a great time. No, we've had some good times together. God willing, we'll have more. So your firm now is Stone and Magnanini. Your partner, Bob, is a great guy. He's a military guy for 30 years. He's retired now, I think, right? And you moved offices. What town are your new offices in? Where are you based?
So we have an office in Berkeley Heights and an office in Hudson Yards, which basically the cleaning lady goes to, because nobody.
Right. Oh, Hudson Yards has got that thing.
But,
what's the name? What is the name of that statue in Hudson? It's not a statue. It's 25. It's 10 stories tall. What is the name of that installation?
Can't remember.
I don't even know.
Yeah, that thing is crazy.
I tell people the story about it.
That thing, the shed.
It's called the what?
No, the shed is where they do the performances.
Hudson Yards installation. And it's a very New York story, right? They build this thing in the middle. It's 10 stories tall. It's basically a staircase. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And what happens with a 10-story tall staircase in the middle of Manhattan? People go up and start jumping off of it and committing suicide. That's the most New York story I can think of.
I was wondering why they had it locked, but I guess that's why.
Do they have it locked now?
I took my kids there and it was locked. Yeah.
Really? Oh, because see, when they first built it,
no, I remember.
It didn't have any glass protectors or anything. Then a few people committed suicide.
That's awesome.
Then they put up these glass walls so that you couldn't jump. And now I guess they gave up on it and just locked it off. I think at one point they're just going to pull it down and put up a statue of somebody, like a fountain or something.
Yeah, they got to figure that place out.
It's called The Vessel,
Okay. Yeah, I forgot the name.
and it is 150 feet tall and has 154 flights of stairs, 80 landings, 2,500 steps. And it was just this crazy experiment. And when you put something like that in the middle of lower Manhattan, what happens? People jump off of it. So it's locked up now.
I should mention, by the way, our town is nominated for a Tony. So if you're a Tony voter, vote for
Oh,
our town.
congratulations. What category in the Tonys? What was
Best,
it?
best revival of a play.
Oh, Best Revival.
Yeah,
Okay. There was that's great. The Tonys are in. When are the Tony Awards coming up?
June like 6th or something.
Oh, so you think you got a chance there?
I think we got a chance. As Yellowface we're nominated against Yellowface, which is was a popular play.
I didn't know that Yellowface was revival.
And there's another play called Eureka Day or something, which people liked. I haven't seen it.
So our
And then,
town.
so then the other ones that didn't even get nominated. So Romeo and Juliet got nominated, but that had a very, people either loved it or they hated it. Believe it or not, Othello didn't even get nominated with Denzel Washington.
Yeah, that was crazy, Othello. And the tickets are like $900 a ticket.
Yeah. So luckily we weren't in George Clooney's category. So,
yeah, I think that's a problem. I really think that when somebody like Denzel Washington comes to Broadway, and then the only people that can afford to see him are people who can shell out like $1,000 for a ticket.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's something about that that just, it makes it, to me, I mean, this guy, I've always admired him so much. And somebody said to me, well, he has no control over the ticket pricing. And I'm like, no, he has total control over the ticket pricing. He's the reason why people are buying tickets. Why wouldn't a Denzel Washington, I don't know. I mean, why are you happy to position yourself where only really rich people can afford to come and see your show? There should be every show they should have something set aside. Like,
I think this is a problem with tickets in general now, right? Like the World Cup. Cup, they're trying to get like $5,000 a ticket, and I mean, I don't like it, and I don't like. I mean, look, I love Broadway, but I think the fact that to have a successful Broadway show, certainly a successful Broadway play, you need to have an A-list actor in it, or people won't go see it, no matter how good it is really unfortunate, because I think there's a lot of great plays out there that, can't get on Broadway because, they don't have access to some, to Hugh Jackman or somebody of that ilk.
Yeah, and it's so expensive to put on a show because a lot of it's the union costs. It's like $1 million just to load a show on, meaning just to take all of the props off the trucks and put them and set them up on a stage and hook everything up. The average cost of that is about $1 million. And I was told that by, I don't want to drop his name, but he's, we both know who the same half dozen people are, and they're the biggest producers on Broadway. There's two paths to becoming major on Broadway, right? You start out as a billionaire, and then you go on Broadway, you just start to produce everything, or you work your way up through the ranks to become, self-made. The latter story is the Kevin McCollum story, right? I think Kevin, he came out of the Pittsburgh program, I think, if I remember correctly. There's a famous theater school in Pittsburgh. So he basically came from a poor background and worked his way up to produce some of the greatest shows, right? Hamilton, in the Heights, all of those shows. And then there are the other side of the business where there's just a lot of wealth. People are wealthy, they like theater, and then they come in and they produce.
But look, in fairness to the producers, of which I am one, it's extremely hard to make money on Broadway. Most shows that go to Broadway don't make money. So it's hard
No, most of them lose.
to begrudge producers who have a show that people actually want to see trying
No,
to
I'm not.
make
It's not
money on
begrudging them, Dave. 5 out of 6 shows lose money, right?
it.
We know that 5 out of 6 lose money. You're lucky to break even on a show. There's a few people you'll always make money. Al Pacino does not lose money on Broadway because the minute you announce it's Al Pacino, you sell the thing out, right? But I'm just saying that there's something amiss when a Denzel Washington, who's had such a great career, then the tail end of that career, you're putting something out there, and the next kid out there. Now, Denzel Washington himself has donated money, has paid for the education of young black actors. The famous one, Bozeman, I think his name was, the one who died from stomach cancer. His career was
The one
Black
that was
Panther.
Black Panther. Yeah.
Yeah, he thanked Denzel Washington publicly at an awards show, and his career was paid for, I believe, by Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington went to school in the Bronx. He went to St. Raymond's High School, then he went to Fordham in Manhattan for a drama department. That's where he comes out of that background. All I'm saying is that,
I think, by the way, I forget his name, the guy who played the Black Panther, but I think I saw him on Broadway when he was like 17 or 18 in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom of all.
yes, I saw that. I think he won for that, didn't he?
I think it was definitely nominated. I don't know if
Yeah,
he
no,
was
that was
really
great.
good. I mean, he's a great actor.
I'm very sad. There's some films that he's in, and I have a hard time watching them, to be honest, because to know that he died young, it makes it hard to watch the film because I feel bad for him. Every time I watch the film, no matter what it's about, I feel bad. But anyway, listen, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much. And again, it's Stone and Magnanini. People can search Dave Stone, False Claims Act, or Dave Stone, litigation lawyer. And I don't want to pigeonhole you as a False Claims Act lawyer. That would be very unfair to you because you've done some amazing trial work. And I remember I asked David Boyes once, I said, like, what is complex? Because on his card it says complex litigation or complex corporate litigation. And I had no clue what that, I wasn't even a lawyer back then. And I said, what does that mean? What is that? And he said this when 2 really rich people sue each other. And that was his, and that is, those words always remembered the things that people say to you. And anyway, he's still going strong, Dave Boyes. And
Yes.
actually, the AIG, Hank Greenberg, he's 100 years old. God bless him.
Yeah. When I represented him, he was sharp as a tack. I mean, and he was pretty old then, but didn't suffer fools gladly. I'll tell you, he was not an easy guy to represent. But
Yeah, fun fact, he and I were in Cuba at the same time. Very random fact. But he had a guy that would, he was going to Cuba, I guess, to spec out business. This had to be in his 90s at this point. And he flew in, and they held him up at the airport, and I got through without a problem because I was part of some Christian group, but they were so enamored with his plane. I know if you've never been to Cuba, but like the first thing they do is they just he got held up at the airport for a while, and I just thought it was so odd that here's this wealthy man who they should have ushered him through without a problem, but in Cuba the rules don't apply the same way they do in the U.S. And
know who he is.
yeah, they knew because the plane, they could tell how many private jets fly into Havana every day. Not a lot.
Well, let me just tell you one last funny story about David Boyes, and then we probably have to wrap up. But so I was doing this. I was the general counsel of the Yankee Nets, and I was co-counsel with David, and we were suing Madison Square Garden. And Chuck Dolan is the chairman of Cablevision. They owned Madison Square Garden. I think they still do. So
Yeah,
anyway,
the Dolan family.
So anyway, we were taking the deposition of Chuck Dolan, and I had done all the preparation, but David was going to take the deposition, and this was like at the same time as like he was doing Bush v. Gore, and like he probably had an argument in the Supreme Court the next week or something. That's the way.
Right.
Anyway, so we have like 20 lawyers. Chuck Dolan. We're at this fancy law firm. They have, scrambled eggs and, potatoes and like this whole lush thing, right? And we're waiting. The deposition was supposed to start at 9. We're there. It's 9:30. No David. Like everybody but David, right? No David. 10 o'clock. People are starting to like, where's David? Chuck Dolan is sitting there, right? David walks in. He looks around. This is 10 o'clock. He looks around. He looks at all this stuff. He goes, "I'll be back in a minute." He leaves. We're all, what the hell was that? He leaves. He comes back like 10 minutes later with like a Dunkin' Donuts bag and a cup of coffee.
Oh my God, that's all he wanted was some Dunkin' Donuts?
It's just like, no, this is a David Boies thing. Like, he never, like, lets the other side kind of get the narrative, right? So
right. He brings his own.
He's not going to eat their breakfast. He's not going to drink their, you know what I'm saying?
I get it. It was,
and he totally for the rest of the day, everybody was like, what the hell was that? Nobody was even focused on the deposition for the rest of the day because it was like, wow, that was something.
That's fascinating. He's an interesting man. And
yeah, he was very, he wore sneakers. He wears sneakers. He wears his watch on the outside of his suit so he can actually see what time it is all the time. He's got a lot of interesting quirks, and he doesn't really care what other people think. It's like,
I think that's one of the keys in life, right? Not caring what other people think. That's a takeaway, huh?
I learned that very late in life, but I definitely believe it now. I just don't care what other people think as long as I'm true to myself. Right, Joe? True to yourself.
Both of us, I think we've both taken that path in life. Yeah, that's why we're such good friends. All right, David, thank you so much. God bless and have a great, thank you for the interview. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Take care.
Bye-bye.